It's my pleasure to now introduce Dr. Corcos. Dr. Daniel Corcos obtained his PhD in 1982 in motor control from the University of Oregon. He completed a postdoctoral fellowship in the Department of Neurosurgery at Rush Medical Center in 1987. Dr. Corcos was on faculty at the University of Illinois at Chicago from 1987 to 2014 and joined the faculty of the Feinberg School of Medicine at Northwestern University in 2014. He has published more than 220 peer-reviewed research articles, and his research has been cited more than 16,000 times. The National Institutes of Health has continuously funded his research since 1986 and has been awarded close to $50 million in grant funding. The goal of the research of Dr. Corcos is to integrate neuroscience and clinical trials to investigate exercise interventions to help people with Parkinson's disease improve their quality of life, mobility, and cognition, and slow down the rate of disease progression. His current research, recently published in the Journal of American Medical Association Neurology, suggests that high-intensity endurance exercise might slow down the rate at which Parkinson's disease progresses. These findings have been covered in the New York Times and the general press worldwide. Dr. Corcos lectures nationally and internationally to physicians, neuroscientists, and people with Parkinson's disease on the benefits of exercise. He has made presentations to the American Parkinson's Disease Association, the Davis Phinney Foundation, and has worked closely with the Parkinson's Foundation to develop exercise guidelines for people with Parkinson's disease. Dr. Corcos, it's a real honor to have you join us today, and so great to have you speak for us on this subject. Welcome. I will pass it over to you now.
Thank you, Alana. I'm very honored and privileged to be able to talk to everybody. So good morning to all of you in Vancouver, British Columbia, and good morning or afternoon to the rest of you, depending where you're tuning in from. So I'm going to talk about the impact of exercise as a means to slow the progression of Parkinson's disease. I went to Washington, D.C. about a decade ago to talk to NIH about presenting a phase 2 clinical trial. And the program officer there asked a question, asked me, but it's just exercise. Why should we be involved in funding studies of just exercise? Well, by the end of today's presentation, I hope to show you that we're making great progress in the science of exercise, and it really is remarkably good for you. But to be fair to my good friend Peter, we've known for a long time that exercise is good for you. You can go back to India 6,000 years ago, or you can go back to Greece 2,500 years ago. And for example, Plato pointed out that lack of activity destroys the good condition of every human being, while movement and methodical physical exercise save it and preserve it. And so we've known this for a long time. But then, of course, there is the problem. So Oscar Wilde is not alone. As he said in the picture of Dorian Gray, to get back my youth, I would do anything in the world except take exercise, get up early, or be respectable. More recently, there's a well-known quote from Robert M. Hutchins. When I feel like exercising, I just lie down until the feeling goes away. He was the president of the University of Chicago for many years and was very influential in their great books curriculum, but one can clearly see his opinion of exercise. Well, I hope to persuade you that if Oscar Wilde and Robert M. Hutchinson's really knew what we know now, they would change their view. So by the end of my presentation today, you should know the importance of performing progressive resistance exercise twice a week. You should know the importance of performing endurance training 3 times a week. And the balance training is very important. Once you know this, you will know the exercise prescription for Parkinson's disease. And we know the prescription for Parkinson's disease. The research over the last 30 years has really been quite clear. And I'm sure I'm talking to some of you who might be in your 40s, early onset, just recently diagnosed, and some of you may be in their 70s or 80s who've had the disease a long time. The prescription in some form is valid at all stages of the disease. The issue is how you modify it depending on the stage of your disease. So what is the principal problem of Parkinson's disease? Well, the principal problem is the progression of disability in Parkinson's disease. This is very well known to movement disorder specialists, and it's becoming better known to physical therapists, occupational therapists, exercise scientists, and other people who help. And if you look over here, this is the degree of disability. So this is more disability and more disability. Parkinson's disease is diagnosed as a movement disorder. You're seen by a movement disorder specialist, but they recognize that there are many, many non-motor symptoms. So people, when they're diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, they will know that they've had the disease for a period of time before. This is called the prodromal stage. At this point, there is no diagnosis yet. Many people have REM, sleep behavior disorder, depression, constipation, anxiety, hyposmia, altered heart rate metrics. And then at some point, one is given a diagnosis based primarily on bradykinesia, with one of rigidity or tremor. There are other aspects to the diagnosis, but the basic diagnosis is slowness of movement coupled with rigidity or tremor. And then we progress through the disability. Chronotropic incompetence means that a person can't scale the heart rate to the task demands. People lose strength, they lose VO2 peak, ability to take in oxygen. They have freezing of gait. Medicine starts to wear off, so you have fluctuations and dyskinesias. Swallowing becomes a problem. Postural instability and gait becomes a problem, as do falls. And down here we have the non-motor signs, two which are very important, and your first lecture in the series of 3 addressed this in some detail. It's cognitive impairment, and one begins with mild cognitive impairment and dementia. And the point I want you to know is that a well thought out lifestyle can slow the progression of disability. Of that, there is no doubt. Whether it can actually stop aspects of disability emerging is a good question. Dementia, for example, is not inevitable. And so what I hope to persuade you over the next 30 to 45 minutes is that exercise coupled with a good lifestyle management can slow this progression. Now, I'm going to share with you a couple of papers which are not on Parkinson's disease, but much of what we talk about in Parkinson's disease, we either learn from other diseases or applies to other diseases. So the very recent paper in Scientific Reports for Alzheimer's disease, large-scale gene expression portrait identifies exercise as the top theoretical treatment. Now, I'm fully aware, as are all of you, that medication, pharmacology, and deep brain stimulation or focused ultrasound are 2 very important treatments for Parkinson's disease, which don't apply to Alzheimer's disease. But what I want you to learn from this paper, which is very technical, is that if you look at this plot here, it shows you these are genes that are upregulated in Alzheimer's disease, the red ones, which are downregulated with exercise. So you're bringing them back to normal. And these are all to do with blood vessels and blood flow. And you see the same point here. And so my guess is that in a few years, we're going to have the same mapping done for Parkinson's disease, showing which genes are upregulated and how exercise downregulates them. And this is taken from a 2013 paper. And this talks about exercise as the pluripotent pill. So this comes out of cardiology. In many respects, cardiology leads the way in exercise, simply because heart attacks and cardiac abnormalities are so important. And I'm not sure you can see it all, but if you work your way through the figures, we have, for example, brain-derived neurotrophic factor is being upregulated by exercise here. If you look over here, these are all the anti-inflammatory cytokines which respond to exercise. And so what you see here is that exercise is doing an enormous amount to modify many aspects of the body. And people don't necessarily realize how broad its impact is, but its impact is broad. So I'm now going to go to a more practical solution to slow down the progression. And one point I want to make is I'm going to show you later on the science that underlies what is arguably the best exercise for you to do. I also am very aware that not everybody likes to exercise, etc., etc. And I do want to make the case that anything is better than nothing. So if you look at the pyramid here, focused breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, meditation are all good for one. And I could imagine, and there's evidence, that focused breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, meditation would be very good for anxiety, depression. I also think it's very good for reducing tremor, which can get exacerbated during exercise. So when I talk to people with Parkinson's disease, they often ask me how to deal with tremor, which may be exacerbated. Well, focused breathing, meditation, progressive relaxation after exercise would be very good. At the top of the pyramid is rowing, cycling, running, fast walking, and incline. And I'm going to show you the data that makes it crystal clear that partaking in those kind of activities is beneficial. Unfortunately, I can't see you all. If I could, I would ask you all the question, how many of you do progressive resistance? Now, I think we had 99 people sign up, and my guess is more than half of you do not do progressive resistance exercise. When I give my lecture to Doctor of Physical Therapy students, a substantial number of them don't. And so at this point in the lecture, I just simply say to them, if it's good enough for the squirrel, why is it not good enough for you? So for those of you who don't do progressive resistance exercise, I hope to persuade you that 100% for sure you should be doing it. So what is the rationale? Well, you increase brain volume, which is good. You increase cortical thickness, which is good because cortical thickness declines as you age. You reverse progression of white matter hypointensities, which is good. You increase the development of blood vessels, and you increase the neurotrophic factors such as BDNF, which I showed you a couple of slides ago, is also upregulated in endurance exercise. So here we have a paper from 2013, which I published in Movement Disorders. And what I want you to see here is that this is a change from baseline in the Motor Unified Parkinson Disease Rating Scale score. So anytime a person will go and see a movement disorder specialist, they will be asked to do things like move their fingers as quickly as possible. They'll be asked to pronate, supinate. The physician will move their limbs to get rigidity. You end up with a score, and that is an assessment of how Parkinsonian a person is. When you have baseline, when you subtract the scores of baseline, you end up with 0. So here we have natural disease progression taken from a paper in 1993. People's Parkinson's disease progresses about 3 points a year. Here we have data from modified fitness counts in black. And what it shows you is that 6 months doing somewhat less demanding exercises. So these exercises were basically balance exercises, range of motion exercises, a little bit of strengthening by assuming static postures, but it wasn't using weights to really get a person stronger. And you'll find at 6 months, both groups get much better. And this is what you find in the literature on exercise. Anything against nothing works well. So some form of exercise is really good because most people are very, very deconditioned. But if you look here, the group which was doing the resistance exercise, they are 7 points better off. 7 points better off at 2 years. I have a video which made it onto TV in America, and the person was very, very excited about the exercise program. In 2015, we published a paper in Movement Disorders, and it was voted the best original research article for 2015 by the editorial board of Movement Disorders. So let me walk you through this. Here we're testing people at 12 months and at 24 months. We didn't find a difference between modified fitness counts and the progressive resistance group. Both forms of exercise were very good for you. And you'll notice again, we have a 0 line here. You would expect cognition to get slightly worse over time. Well, it didn't. In our case, whether it is looking at the digit span, how many digits you can remember, the Stroop color word interference test, how does one stimuli interfere with another stimuli, and the brief test of attention, how well you can attend to objects, all stayed the same or got better over time. And this is the part that the layperson and even many scientists do not fully recognize, that by exercising your muscle, you do in fact improve cognition. I've got wonderful colleagues in Brazil, and they have tried progressive resistance exercise with instability. So if we look over here, the person is doing their squatting up and down here. And this requires terrific attention because you've really got to concentrate. And then you're getting a lot of feedback coming from all of your muscles. When you stretch a muscle, it sends a message to the sensory motor cortex, part of your brain. That then gets transferred to the motor cortex. So these activities are involving the brain loops in considerable detail. And because these are whole body exercises, they managed to only use 5, but you can see you're using major muscle groups here of the leg. And again, you're using major muscle groups here. And here you're using major arm and shoulder muscle groups. And again, major arm and shoulder muscle groups. So the Montreal, actually, it is great that I'm talking to a Canadian group, because the standard assessment was developed in Canada. So here we have the Montreal Cognitive Assessment Score, and 26 and below is deemed mild cognitive impairment. This was the control group. This is the resistance training group. This is the resistance training and stability group. And you'll see a considerable number of the people here were deemed to have mild cognitive impairment. And you now look at the MoCA scores following the instability training, and they are doing much better. So this is a second evidence, and there's much more in the literature. I'm sure that the first presenter also discussed a lot of information showing the benefits of cognition. I'm not going to read this to you, just take it on faith that the rationale for endurance exercise is compelling, and it's been looked at for decades. And there's evidence in humans, people with Parkinson's disease, animal models. The science here is very strong. So I'm going to walk you through the SMARC study, which was published in JAMA Neurology 2018. And the primary purpose was to look at the feasibility and safety of high-intensity endurance exercise. At this time, it wasn't known for people in Parkinson's disease. We did not know whether people who have not yet taken medication can exercise at 80 to 85% of their maximum heart rate for 4 days a week, and is it safe? Then we also collected data on the motor signs, and we wanted to know, was there a significant change in the motor signs to make it worthwhile warranting a phase 3 clinical trial? For all of those who've been following COVID's had several phase 3 clinical trials, and phase 3 clinical trials, they're basically designed to change clinical practice. This is a hard slide to follow. The point I want you to take away is we randomized 128. One group was high intensity, 80 to 85% of maximum group. Another was moderate intensity, 60 to 65% of maximum heart rate. And then we had a usual care group so that we could compare them with these two groups. The usual care then was offered the opportunity to go into the high intensity or moderate intensity. It's not ethical to randomly assign groups of people to usual care for a long period of time and not avail them of the opportunity to take part in high intensity or moderate intensity. So we had 38 with 6-month follow-up data, 42 with 6-month follow-up data in the moderate intensity, and then we had 37 in the usual care group. So the take-home message is people stuck with the intervention for 6 months. And what did we learn? Well, we learned that people can exercise at 80 to 85% of their maximum heart rate. This is from weeks 9 to 26. We took the first 8 weeks to make sure that people could get used to exercising at this high heart rate. If you decide to start working out and you haven't worked out before, don't jump into it. Ease yourself in. Otherwise, you're going to have aches, pains, and you'll probably think to yourself, this is no fun. So anytime you start to exercise, start slow, easy, and gentle, and let your body adapt. And then we also learned that if you want to target 4 days, then, well, people exercise about 3.5 days. So if you really must have exercise, if you really must have people exercise 4 days a week, you should probably tell them 5. And very understandable. It's very easy in a week to miss an exercise session. I want to show you this slide because, again, this is the 6-month change in UPDRS motor score. And you'll see here, there's virtually no change at 6 months. I'm going to show you an easier slide on my next slide to walk you through the change between the 3 groups, 80 to 85, 60 to 65 in usual care. I just want to show you that there's variability in response. So not everybody responds to exercise in the same way. And the single most important thing to do is to listen to your body and how you respond. There's no question at a population level, or if you look at all people with Parkinson's disease, it's terrific. Just how good it is for you, you want to listen to your body and learn. But the data from this paper was crystal clear. So the group who exercised at 80 to 85% didn't change very much at 6 months, because again, this is a 6-month change score. The usual care group by 6 months had progressed by about 4.2 points. So we were very encouraged with this. But the most important thing about science is science needs to be replicated. So just because a person publishes a finding doesn't mean to say that it's true, and it doesn't mean to say that it will apply to everybody. And so I was very encouraged when in 2019, the team from Holland, the lead author is Dr. Van der Kolk, and the last author is my good friend Bastian Bloom. They did essentially the same study. The only difference is that their people were more advanced. So in my study, people had not yet taken medication. And what I want you to notice, if you compare the aerobic intervention, they actually got fractionally better at 6 months with the active control that progressed. So when I saw this study, I was very comforted because it's certainly no fun if people can't replicate your work. Then in 2021, Dr. Mack published another important study, and she did what is called multimodal intervention. This is brisk walking and balance exercise. And the brisk walking group improved by 6 points. The control group improved by 1.4 points. You look at the difference, and it's 4.6 points. Virtually the same as my study, virtually the same as the Van der Kolk study. So what you have here in terms of progression, which was the title of my talk, is that 3 studies have now shown that endurance exercise may slow progression. So this is my study, the SPARKS 2, and those who worked out at the high intensity stayed flat over 6 months. Again, this is the MDS UPDRS. The group that didn't, their disease progressed. This is the study by Van der Kolk. Their group progressed who didn't work out at high intensity. The other group got either slightly better or stayed the same. And if you look at the blue lines and the red lines, you can kind of superimpose them. The difference here is disease progression and disease severity. Their group was further in the disease, but this shows the point that it doesn't matter where you are in the disease, the principle still applies. And then the Mack case, they actually got improvement in both. So it wasn't only the progression which was being slowed, there was actually symptom modification. And so the 4 key points are that the initial disease severity will probably affect the change in signs and symptoms. The brisk walking was just that. They were exercising at close to 80% of peak heart rate, and sometimes the heart rate went higher. And it's important to note that the really slightly stronger results of MAC is probably because she used a bimodal intervention. Now, I've just walked you through probably 5 scientific papers which really make the case for progressive resistance exercise and endurance. But I do not want you to think that that's all that I think is important. That's absolutely not true. So other exercise modalities are very important. So cycling, I've got many friends in Holland, and with 17 million residents and 23 million bicycles, the Netherlands already has more bikes than people. Now, most of you won't understand my next comment, but if we have a cyclist amongst the 99 people, and if I was to ask the cyclist, what is the optimum number of bicycles you have, they would answer N+1. So for a cyclist, one can never have too many bicycles. Now, aqua aerobics is great. I'm a big fan of aqua aerobics. When I go to my health club, many people are taking part in aqua aerobics. It's easier on the body, easier on the joints. If you happen to have a slightly larger frame, the water is helpful. Move Big is very popular, and it helps reduce the restricted range of movements people with Parkinson's disease have. I'm a huge fan of dance, and rock-steady boxing is terrific. I tend not to study them because quantifying the dose of exercise becomes very difficult, and that's really what I'm trying to do. But I want to leave a very strong take-home message that these alternative exercise modalities are terrific. And let me show you why I'm unabashedly in favor of them. So this is arguably the favorite slide that I ever show, because what you've got here is a group of people. They're socially engaged, they're exercising, they're engaged with each other. And when I look at this, I'm looking at a group of people who've basically taken ownership of their disease. For sure, they have Parkinson's disease. They know it, but it's not going to define who they are. And they just get on with life. Now, the third part of the prescription is very important. As the disease progresses, one does end up with postural instability, and postural instability can lead to falling, and falling can lead to fractures, and fractures can lead to death. So anything one can do to maintain one's postural stability is very important. Simple test one can give oneself is how long can one stand on one leg? And if one's not standing on one leg for a good length of time, 20, 30, 40 seconds, then one should see a PT or somebody to help you. This study was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it shows that Tai Chi, which again, I'm a big fan of, increased the maximum excursion of people, and it improved their directional control. And so this is the third part. And so what is the exercise prescription? Weight training twice a week. Meta-analyses are studies which pull together lots and lots of studies, so you get a global gestalt, and the effect size is substantial, 0.5 or greater. There are 2 meta-analyses published in 2022 on endurance training. They both show fear effects. And then there's balance training. So what should you do? Well, to help your Parkinson's disease, take 1 aspirin every day, and then take it out for a run or on your treadmill, then take it to the gym, and then to Tai Chi class, etc., etc. I've spent a considerable amount of time working with different groups and foundations. I looked, for example, at the webpage of the group I'm talking to today, and there's a huge amount of very, very valuable information there for you. And so for those of you who haven't toured the webpage, you should certainly do that. You should certainly browse it at length. There is some wonderful information. The Parkinson Foundation put together this simple, relatively simple one page to kind of help people deal with the aerobic part, the strength part, the balance, agility, multitasking, and flexibility. And then they look at the FIT principle, which is frequency, intensity, time, and type of exercise. And this is all online at the Parkinson Foundation and is very, very helpful. I was talking to Alana earlier on, and I think many of you listening today probably know everything I've said. And the real challenge is to get out into communities where people don't have access to these resources. So if any of you go and ever speak about Parkinson's disease to communities, to outreach the communities, we've certainly prepared this document, which is a little easier to understand. I'm going to Ohio in May, and I've been asked to talk there and present at the 5th grade level. One of the important things about talking to people is to pitch information at the level that resonates with the person. And so we have information here, which is a little easier to understand. So by now, you should realize that the data and evidence is crystal clear. But the challenge is how to get people to exercise. So physical therapy is great. In America, in Chicago, one sees the physical therapist at the same time as a movement disorder specialist, and the therapist assesses function as soon as you're diagnosed. So they have a kind of a baseline from which to go from, and then they may see you every 6 months or a year, and they can give you a prescription if you're having a specific problem like falling, freezing. Individual training for those who have the finances. Personal trainers are terrific. I've seen very impressive results for people with Parkinson's disease. Some people love groups like Rocksteady Boxing. I've also had experience working with the frail elderly to train caregivers who go into homes to administer exercise interventions. Dyad training is when you work in pairs, which has been very useful. And then there are computer apps and support groups. If you happen to ride a bicycle, Zwift is tremendous. If you like to store your data, Strava is tremendous. Twitchy Women, it's a lady in California who happens to love the Eagles, which is where Twitchy Woman comes from. And her group is predominantly for females. And there's a wealth of information she goes through, and it's very, very helpful. And then there are groups on Facebook, because sometimes people just need an element of support. And so, for example, if you have a friend and you do your workout and post it to Strava, and he or she doesn't do a workout and post it to Strava, you can send them a little text. Hope to see you back on tomorrow. And to love oneself is the beginning of a lifelong romance. And I think part of this is about learning to really love oneself and look after oneself. So didn't agree with Oscar Wilde at the beginning of my talk, but I'm agreeing with Oscar Wilde towards the end of my talk. I Zoom with between 20 and 60 people every month, and it can be done. So last November, they all sent me what is called a Kudo board. And as you'll see, these people all have Parkinson's disease, but it absolutely doesn't get in the way of their life at all. For those of you who are more, who've got a deeper background in science, you should think about looking at Chapter 11 of Brain Health and Brain-Related Disorders. This is the American College of Sports Medicine. It's guidelines for exercise testing and prescription, and I was involved in a major rewrite of edition 11. So for those of you who want much, much more technical details, it's all in there. And for those of you who are partners, spouses, caregivers, children, etc., what I basically said is 100% consistent with the Center for Disease in America, National Health Service in England. I'm sure there's Canadian recommendations entirely consistent with this. And so at that point, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. And I'm sure Alana will have one or more questions for me.
Thank you, Dr. Corcos. That was an amazing presentation, and thank you for sharing such great research. We do have some questions. Just a reminder to folks that you can either type your question in the chat box, or you can also use the raise hand function at the bottom of your screen. If you find it difficult to type, you can verbally ask your question if you use the raise hand function. So we have one question here. Why is VO2 max impacted by Parkinson's disease? How would the VO2 max numbers differ for those with PD versus those without PD?
Well, that's a good question. So what happens with many people with PD is they start to move less, they start to do less. And if you look at activity patterns, etc., the activity level reduces. And so you then get into a vicious cycle that the less you do, the less you can do. And once one stops doing various exercises, then one's VO2 peak will reduce. So there have been several papers which have made it clear that the VO2 peak of people with Parkinson's disease compared to healthy age-matched controls is less. That doesn't mean to say that for any individual, they can't have a high VO2 peak. So I've got friends, colleagues with Parkinson's disease who have very impressive VO2 peaks. But really, it's a kind of a measure of disuse. And so the less you're walking around, the less activity you do, the less endurance activity you do, the lower your VO2 peak will become. And in America, the Cardiology Society suggested in 2016 that this should be considered a vital sign, because as your VO2 peak drops, then doing all kinds of activities become harder. So I would encourage you to exercise and keep your VO2 peak up.
And we have another question, and just for clarification for those who don't know what VO2 max is, what is it?
Well, it is the ability to use oxygen. Okay, so when you start to exercise, you need to use more and more oxygen. And if you can't metabolize oxygen very well, then you end up with a low VO2 peak. And then as you get better and fitter, you can take in more oxygen, transport the oxygen through the system, then goes to your blood, etc., and from your blood to your neurons. And so this is very beneficial for you. So the higher your VO2 peak is, the better your body can metabolize oxygen.
Is there a relationship with breathing rate and heart rate?
Yes, yes. The higher your heart rate goes, the higher you breathe. So one way you can tell if you're doing moderate intensity exercise is if you go out for a walk with a friend and you can talk, your breathing rate won't be too high and your heart rate won't be too high. Then as you start to walk faster or go up a hill or start to jog, your breathing rate will pick up, your heart rate will pick up, and your ability to converse will drop.
Okay, I think that question was from Shabir, and I think they also have their hand raised, so I'm just gonna unmute them so that they can verbally ask.
Hi, Shabir.
So go ahead and unmute, Shabir, and you can ask your question.
Second. Yeah, can you hear me now?
Loud
Yes.
and clear.
Okay, good. So that I do variety of exercise, and I found that certain exercise I'll be huffing and puffing. My heart rate is low, like hiking. I can be pushing up the hill. I feel like I'm huffing, but when I look at my polar watch, I'm not, doing much as far as heart rate. And there are times where I'll swim and I'll do very extensive, intense swimming. And does the heart rate go up? So that's what I'm kind of wondering. The bicycle stations that I do, it seems like I'm not pushing, my heart rate goes up, even though the breathing doesn't. So that's why my question came.
Yeah, this is complicated to answer at an individual level.
Okay.
So if one is exercising and if one can, it's always good to get a heart rate. And I think you have a polar heart rate.
Yeah.
And then the question becomes, what is your maximum heart rate? So one way to get a maximum heart rate is you take your age and you subtract it from 220. So if one is 65, one's maximum heart rate should be about 155. But that doesn't always work because some people have a lower heart rate. So one thing you can do, for example, is you could put yourself on a treadmill or somewhere that you're safe, or a bike, and you could work out as hard as you can, only be for a short period of time, and get your heart rate as high as you can. And then you will know what your maximum heart rate is. And then when you swim and when you do other activities, you will have a landmark against which you can assess. Now, for those of you, it's a little difficult to get this, but if one has a heart problem, one can actually go for a cardiopulmonary exercise test where they will tell you what your VO2 peak is, and they will tell you what your maximum heart rate is. And if one has the money, one can also do this privately. It's expensive, it's several $100s, but the more research I do and the more questions I get like this question, the more I think it's good to sometimes have a cardiopulmonary exercise test, because that way for sure they will tell you what your maximum heart rate is. And if your maximum heart rate, for example, is 120, and if when you're hiking, you're at 110, yeah, you're doing high intensity exercise for sure.
Thank you, Dr. Corcos.
I think, yeah, the questions seem to be going. Feel free to ask questions, and there are no silly questions.
That's right. There's never a silly question. So there's another question here from Krista.
Hi, Krista.
Could you expand on or explain the link between increased C-reactive protein, Parkinson's disease, and exercise? Could increased CRP cause a significant and sudden increase in Parkinson's disease symptoms?
Well, that's a very, very good question. If you send me an email, Krista, I'll send you a paper which we've just written on this. So I'm going to go slowly because many people won't understand the question. Okay, so C-reactive protein is a very general marker of inflammation. So I'm not going to talk about Parkinson's disease for the moment. I will get to Parkinson's disease. It's a very good marker for general inflammation. So if you were to have any inflammatory process going on, you will have an acute increase in CRP. And then as the inflammation goes away, CRP will drop. Now, in Parkinson's disease, there have been several studies recently which link Parkinson's disease to inflammation. And if you look at population studies, CRP does increase over time, and CRP does relate to disease severity. So one way to think of it is that it is a measure of generalized inflammation, not specific to Parkinson's disease at all. In fact, most of the work has been done in other diseases, including cardiac, diabetes, etc. Now, CRP, or if you like, an index of inflammation, does respond beneficially to exercise, especially endurance exercise. And if one is able ever to get a measure of CRP when one has one's blood drawn, it's probably a good thing to look at. And I think that if it is a little bit high, it's just one more reason to exercise and one more motivating factor for one to exercise. So I hope I've answered most of your question.
Thank you. And next question from Kenji. Any recommendations regarding intensity and volume, power zones and workout length? I find that when I go into zone 3 and above, the increase in intensity requires recovery, which in turn impacts the volume of exercise. Also, if you need me to repeat any question, please let me know.
No, I think this is a very hard question. This is one you should probably email me, because I'm pretty sure you're a cyclist, and cyclists work in zones 1, 2, 3, etc. And cyclists tend to work quite closely with wattage as opposed to heart rate. So the first take-home message is recovery is absolutely important. Had I had longer, I would have, or I can come back sometime in the future and give you the talk about how to consider oneself an athlete. And I think the people who think like an athlete do best. So thinking like an athlete means, yes, you work hard, but you also rest hard. And so you can't do these high intensity endurance exercises every day. You certainly need rest. So in terms of the cycling, you know, one can go at zone 1 and zone 2 all day. But as one goes up and as one pushes interval training, then one needs a while to recover. And so this is all about listening to one's body. So when I talk about 4 days a week at 80 to 85%, again, some people may find that too much and would prefer 3.5 days. You wonder why I say 3.5 days, because that's alternate days. When you exercise 4 times in a week, you're going to have back-to-back days. And for some people, back-to-back at 80 to 85% may be too much. For others, it may be just fine. You know, a lot depends on your overall physiology, but the benefits of cycling on Parkinson's disease are clear. The most stunning paper in the literature by far is a paper by J. Alberts and colleague in 2009. And I would certainly encourage one to cycle, but I think it's really important to look at one's recovery. So that's a major take home of this lecture, is recovery is important. And so, you know, going back to your question, many people like working out in the higher zones, which is where your heart rate goes up, but you can only do it for a short period of time, and you just have to listen to your body. The next question.
Okay, we have a question from Ted. I heard that if the same exercises are always used, their impact lessens. Is this true?
Well, that is a good question. and I'm not sure who said that. I don't know whether that's true. I can tell you for sure that I would not recommend the same exercise. And I wouldn't recommend it partly because of the mind, partly because of the muscles. So to be clear, I think always being on a treadmill for some people is not fun. Always being on the treadmill can give rise to injuries. And always being on the treadmill means that your brain, spinal cord, and muscles are always doing the same thing. And the brain and the body respond to novelty and adaptation. So for me, I love to bike. I row. I use a treadmill. I use elliptical. I sometimes use Stairmaster. And I think this then gives the body, it gives some muscles of the body a rest, as you can now work on other muscles. And so I do think it is good to rotate. For those of you who are cyclists, you'll know you go through probably 4 parts of a year. For those who compete, you have your competitive summer. And then just before that period, you start to build. And then over the winter, you take some time to rest and you do longer, slower rides where you're keeping your heart rate ticking over, but not close to max. And so there are many, many ways that one can exercise. And I am a big proponent of, some would call it cross-training. So you go from one exercise to another. And I certainly find when I do that, some people can find doing the same thing a little boring. So when you rotate from the bike to the treadmill, there's also an immense benefit to being outside. I've actually been up in Vancouver, biking around Vancouver. I think there's a park with a nice climb you can go round and round in. And so if one's out in an environment like that, I think it's terrific. So I think the thing to do is listen to your body, exercise in different ways, but at some point, if you really want to delay progression, one does have to get the heart a little elevated, and that's the part that some people struggle with.
We do have a few more questions, but we're at 11 o'clock. Are you okay to answer some, or do you
Yes, no, that's fine. We'll just keep going and we'll just see who has the most stamina, whether I fall asleep first or whether there are no questions left. So,
thank you, that's kind. Okay, so I'll go on to the next question. We have a question from William. What was the formula for determining heart rate?
One formula is 220 minus your age. So if you're 65, you take 220, subtract 65, and your peak heart rate should be about 155. Please note the formula is not perfect, okay? And we have data that some people can be as low as 120, 115. If you use the formula and you find that you're well off, you may want to discuss that with your physician. There will be examples. Then the other thing which you all need to know is if you are on beta blockers, and I would suspect a quarter of you are on beta blockers, the beta blocker can reduce your peak heart rate. So the formula absolutely does not necessarily apply. And so if in doubt, discuss with a physician or a cardiologist.
We have a question from Valerie. If you miss exercise for some days, for example, post knee or hip replacement, and you sense a degradation of symptoms, can exercise return you to baseline?
Did you mean degradation of symptoms, or did you mean that the symptoms started to get a little bit worse.
I was wondering the same thing, actually.
So let's assume that you've had a surgical procedure which has minimized your amount of exercise. And let's assume that your Parkinsonism has got slightly worse. Clearly, if it's gotten better, that raises an issue as to how much more exercising you should be doing. But I think that's unlikely to be the case for many people. I think we've actually had a natural experiment for lack of exercise in Parkinson's disease, and it's called COVID-19. So every group that I talk to notice a decline in the general health well-being of the person with Parkinson's disease and an increase in their symptoms or signs. So a symptom is what a person talks about. A sign is what a physician assesses. And it was getting so bad in Chicago at one of the Northwestern hospitals that the person who ran many, many programs for people with Parkinson's disease, I think there are now 60 programs offered at Northwestern Lake Forest, that she requested that the in-person activity programs continued despite the fact that there were bans on people assembling with COVID-19, and she got that approved. So the argument was that the potential problems associated with gathering a group of people together were less than people with Parkinson's disease not continuing their program. So that to me is the kind of clearest natural experiment that the natural experiment that not doing activity is not good for a lot of people. Now, can one get back to where one was? I would say, by and large, for sure. Now, there are always caveats. So for any kind of surgery, for knee, hip, ankle, the single most important thing to do is one has to do one's PT religiously. 2 years ago, I ruptured my Achilles tendon, and I got right back to where I was, but it took 6 months of very, very hard work. Now, the Parkinson's disease continues to progress, and one continues to get a little bit older. So one may not go right back to where one was, but one might even get better. So sometimes when you go in and really rehab well, you end up with a stronger joint. It depends on the surgery. It depends on the particular problem. But I would be very, very encouraged that you can get back to where you were. And if you think you're not, then you need to find out what the issue is. But I think I would be encouraged.
We had a follow-up question from Kenji. I'm guessing he is a cyclist because he typed yes. I think that's what he was referring to. And he has a question from a zone perspective. What does the current research recommend? Zone 2 with a few sprints versus zone 3 versus zone 4 or 5?
Yeah, there is just no research on this, okay? There is no research on this. And I would actually, from the Parkinson's perspective, I would not use the zones or convert the zones. I would just think heart rate. Now, I know for a cyclist that can be hard, but at least once a week, just think heart rate. So I would be on my bike, and I would certainly do 30 minutes, 3-4 times a week with your heart rate at 80 to 85%. If you want to do a couple of sprints in that period of time, I think that's probably only going to be helpful. but one has to be very careful, as you know, because if you're holding 80 to 85% heart rate and you start going much above 90% heart rate, you reach a point that you can't hold it. So you have to be very careful. So there is no data out there on zones. If you really, you can always send my very dear friend Jay Alberts an email. He's an avid cyclist, and maybe he can give you a slightly different answer. But at the end of the day, the work we're doing is all heart rate related. And so I would think in terms of heart rate and not zones. Now, I understand that if one is, if you have a race, or if all of your training programs are structured around zones, that gets a little bit difficult. But at the moment, I just can't do the quick conversion between all the zones, the heart rates, the time you're exercising to give you a better answer.
And we have a comment from Krista. Thank you for the info regarding CRP. I will email, as I would love to read the article. Also, I have several more questions about it. So they can either email, you can either email it to me, I can forward it to her, or I don't know how you feel about sharing your email, Dr. Corcos, but.
It's fine. If I get overwhelmed, I may just not be able to respond. But I'll be certainly looking for Krista's email to come in. And if you just put on the heading CRP, because we have written a very nice, when I say we, I've got a couple of colleagues who are absolute experts on CRP. This is not my field, but I think you'll enjoy reading the paper because it is written at a not exactly a lay person's level, but it's a relatively easy read. So Krista, if you read it and you think that I'm wrong, let me know, and then I'll never say that again publicly.
And we have a question from Vicky. When you speak about cycling being one of the best exercises, can it be on a stationary bicycle?
Oh, for sure. It's actually better on a stationary bicycle. So I've forgotten the gentleman's name. The beautiful thing about stationary bicycle is, one, you have no traffic lights. So whenever you're outdoors bicycling, there's always, the traffic light problem and the traffic problem and everything else. And the nice thing about cycling indoors is, depending on what kind of bike you have, you can have measures of distance, measures of power, measures of heart rate, and then you can play between them to decide what you need to work on. So some people just lack basic muscle power. They're just not strong enough to really drive their heart hard enough. And so when you have power meters, you can get an estimate of how much power you can generate, and that can be helpful. So,
sorry, go ahead.
No. Next question, please.
I actually had a question about dance. I know you're especially a proponent of dance when it comes to Parkinson's disease. And I wondered if you could maybe expand on that a little bit.
Yes. So we can just start with the evidence. So if you go to the literature, there's paper after paper after paper showing how good dance is. Okay. So the question is, why is dance good? Dance is good partly because people with Parkinson's disease often, especially as the disease progresses, have difficulty generating a movement themselves. By that, I mean, you're just sitting somewhere and now you decide that you want to move. This is what is called an internally generated movement. And as the disease progresses, people can have more and more difficulty with that. the extreme example of this is when you're standing somewhere and you just can't move. You just freeze, where the term freezing of gait comes from. So the treatments for the inability to initiate a movement oneself all focus on providing external stimuli. And this can be done in many ways. So one way is through the auditory system. So you can call to somebody or shout to somebody. There's the very, very well and frequently discussed example of there's a fire in a building and all of a sudden people with Parkinson's disease who didn't appear to be able to move that well can suddenly move quite quickly. And that's because they're getting all these external stimuli to help them move. So the auditory system is very, very potent in helping people move. And music is one aspect of dance which can help. And it gives one a rhythm. Dancing can often be with a partner. So you have tactile, kinesthetic, proprioceptive cues when you're holding one's partner. And that can be very, very helpful. And so, and then there's the third system, which is the visual system. So you'll find, for example, you can buy walking sticks with a flashing laser. You can buy frames to push with lights. And so coming back to the dance, what you get is you get visual, auditory, tactile cues that help you move. And you see the same kind of thing in the same kind of issue in singing. People feel better and they talk better when they've been doing singing. So for those of you who have the ability to go dance, I would. Certainly, if I had Parkinson's disease, I would put it right at the forefront of the activities that I do. If for no other reason, if you look at dancers, they have good balance. And so if you're moving around a dancing floor and you're working on your balance, this just has to be a good thing. And so, as I mentioned, I would put it very high up on the list of things that I would do. And probably as my disease progressed, I might move it higher up on the list. Now, it also turns out that you can get a pretty good workout dancing. I don't think it's quite the same as on a bike, but you look at some people dance and, you know, you can certainly reach a point when your heart rate and your breathing are going up. It really depends on the kind of dance and how it's structured. But I'm a big fan, have no doubt. And for those of you who want to read any of the literature, you should read the work of Dr. Madeline Hackney. She's at Emory University, and she's written paper after paper on the benefits of dance.
Okay, thank you for that response. I think those are all of our questions, but we have many comments in the chat box thanking you for such an amazing presentation and that it was inspiring and so forth. So please do, before you sign off, Dr. Corcos, please do read those comments in the chat box. It looks like somebody just raised their hand. Do you have time for one more?
Well, I do. I am not yet asleep, Alana. I'm not yet asleep. So I'll just have a little bit more coffee to keep me going, and I look forward to the next question.
Okay, so last question. Go ahead, Janice. You can unmute. Janice, did you have your hand up? Oh, maybe she did it by mistake.
Okay, well, if you're still there, Janice, you can always say just hello. So I'm going to say, hi, Janice.
She might have pressed the button by mistake.
Oh, hang on a minute. I've just seen a good friend of mine came up. Paula, how are you? Paula, perhaps you can unmute.
Oh, yes, I see Paula Sussman.
Yes, yes, I know Paula very well. I just wanted to say hello, Paula.
She hasn't put her hand up.
Okay.
But she can hear you.
Okay, well, I'm glad. I actually Zoom with Paula monthly, so I look forward to seeing her in a month, Zooming with her in a month.
Nick says, I am a regular walker in my neighborhood. I receive positive comments from those who see me. Thank you for a very informative presentation. Can you recommend an online fitness class? Question from Jerry.
Oh.
There's so many, I'm sure.
I'll tell you what. I'm happy to work with you, Alana. I want to be real careful how I answer this question because I for sure know that if I recommend A, I'm going to get a lovely email from my friends B, C, D, E, and F as to why you didn't. What I'm happy to do, Alana, is to put you in contact with all the groups that I work with. I want to be crystal clear. I have no favorites. Okay. I think all the groups are tremendous. What is particularly great about your group, of course, is, you could provide considerable support for people in and around Vancouver, but also around the world because you can access your website. And so I work with groups which are basically stationed in different parts of America, for example, Virginia or Texas or California, to name but three. So what maybe we can do is I can put you in contact with some of them, Alana, and then you can find a way to highlight them on your webpage. If the person wants to email me directly, I'll give you a direct answer. But since this Zoom could be listened to by all my good friends, I definitely want to plead the fifth because there are some wonderful programs online. I just decided a long time ago that I'm not in the business of advocating one over the other because they're all terrific. But I would be happy to, the person emails me, I'll be, especially with a more specific question. So for example, some of the sites are really, really great at doing seated exercises because for some people, his posture and balance is getting a little bit advanced. They find it much more comfortable, and you can do very, very good, vigorous seated exercises, especially if you have a really gifted dance instructor leading them. So I think what we'll do, Alana, is you and I can work on ways to maximize the number of people we help.
I think that sounds great. And would you prefer that they emailed me questions for you and then I forward them to you?
Yes, I think that would be much easier now. Okay. So you have my email address, you can maybe forward me a group because, and maybe in a week or so's time, because if 10 people are asking me the same question, then it's much easier. The other thing is that if a lot come in, I may just invite everybody to one of my Zoom meetings, because the whole reason I started the Zoom meeting was I am busy. And if I get overwhelmed with emails, it's a little time consuming. I also recognize that I perhaps have information that if I share is helpful. And so the Zoom meeting was designed to let people ask more questions. So why don't you get everything, why don't you get a list of people and then you and I can decide how best to help most people.
Yeah, so I think the best thing is if you have any questions, follow-up questions, I'll give you, because I also need to kind of give a cutoff date as well. So I'll give you till next Wednesday for me to email any questions that you would like me to forward to Dr. Corcos, and then we'll take it from there. And I think that'll be easier rather than sharing your email and having people email you on an ongoing basis or at different times, right?
With there being one exception, the CRP, I've forgotten the lady's name, my apologies, but by all means email me and I'll send you that paper.
I'll email Krista your email address.
Okay. Yeah, Krista. Okay. Yeah, that's great.
Okay, so I have 2 last questions.
Then I have 2 last answers.
I think the other person has left, but I think it's Krista.
Oh, hi, Krista. Perhaps I can get to see you, Krista.
Krista, you need to unmute.
Am I there? I think I'm there.
Yes, we hear you loud and clear,
wonderful.
Krista.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to email Alana as well, whichever works best for you, but I really appreciate you answering those questions. It's an ongoing and very personal thing in our family. So and you gave us the most sort of information I have had for, a year. So I appreciate it. And I don't mind, however you work, I can email Alana and you can pass it on. That would be great. If that works.
Sure. Can I ask, what is your background?
I'm a physio, a retired physio.
Okay, you're a retired physio.
Yeah, well, I've sort of come out of retirement to work with my husband who has PD, but my background is manual therapy, not neuro.
Well, once a PT, always a PT, and I have no doubt as part of your training you covered neuro, so we'll just have to help refresh all of your neurons.
Oh, we're doing that.
Okie doke.
And the last question from Kenji, weight training versus body weight resistance training. I think he wants you to answer which is better, such as push-ups, wall, sit, isometric exercises, pull-ups.
I think whatever you enjoy the most. For many people, getting out to a gym and finding all of the equipment can be difficult. And if you can set up routines that you can do at home using body weight, but at the end of the day, the weights do allow you to do more than just the body weight, but you can do an immense amount with body weight. And so I tend not to view it as either or. So for example, if one's traveling, body weight's the best way to go. You can do it in your room. If one is right close to a gym, which has all the exercise machines, and the other advantage is it really does allow you to progress in a regimented way. So you can you can do your bench press. You can start with 3 by 10 by, let's say, 40 pounds. And then after a few weeks, you add a few more pounds, and then you're doing 45 pounds and 50 pounds. And you can really see a linear progression in a way that with body weight you can't. But I tend not to ever, it's never an either or. It's really a question of, if you could only do body weight for various reasons, it's way better than nothing. And the difference between body weight and actually using weights is much, much smaller than the difference between not doing either of them.
Okay, well, again, thank you so much for such an informative presentation. It was so interesting. And of course, thank you for staying on later to answer so many of the great questions that we had today.
Well, it was a real privilege talking to all my friends up in Canada. So always nice talking to Canadians. I'm PI of a phase 3 clinical trial, and we have a site up at the University of Alberta. So we value Canadians immensely.
Oh, great. Well, we have to have you back again to speak. We would love that. Maybe even in person, who knows?
Oh, coming up to Vancouver is not difficult. Vancouver is one of the great cities in the world, if you can afford to live there. But that's another story for another day.
Yes,
so,
everybody seems to say that if you can afford to live here, that is true.
Yeah, no, coming up to Vancouver would not be a problem. So might see you soon.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for attending.